For 24 years, Judge Meredith Langford ruled her courtroom with an iron fist, silencing lawyers and ruining lives with her biased rulings. Until Douglas Hayes, a fearless attorney, turned the tables. Representing Tyrone Wilkes, a man falsely accused of armed robbery, Douglas faced Langford's blatant prejudice head-on, only to unveil a meticulously planned takedown as federal agents stormed the courtroom to arrest the corrupt judge for bribery and abuse of power. Her empire crumbled in the very place she once dominated. This is a gripping tale of justice, resilience, and the fight against systemic corruption, where one man's courage exposed a decades-long reign of injustice. Watch to discover how a single trial reshaped a courtroom and delivered a powerful reckoning. Douglas Hayes stepped into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He'd been here before, but this time felt different. He wasn't just another lawyer facing Judge Langford, nor merely another name on her docket. Today he carried a weapon she couldn't anticipate. At 48, Douglas had earned a name far beyond Alabama, taking on cases others shunned and dismantling prosecutors' arguments with surgical precision. This made him a target for someone like Langford, but fear never deterred him. What gave him a moment's pause was the look in her eyes. She despised him, not for his case or his words, but for who he was. Douglas felt the gravity of the moment settle on him. This wasn't just about his client Tyrone Wilkes, a man wrongly accused of armed robbery. It was about something far greater, and he wouldn't leave this room without making that clear. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Langford muttered, barely glancing up from the papers before her. "You're already on thin ice in my court. Don't waste my time today." The warning was unnecessary. The trial hadn't even started, but her intent was clear. She meant to dominate. Douglas clutched his briefcase, sensing the charged air, but his face remained impassive. "I'll do my best not to, Your Honor," he replied evenly. Langford's lips curled into a smile devoid of warmth, only condescension. "Good. I have a full schedule and I don't need dramatics." Her attention shifted to the district attorney's table where Philip Callow, a brash young assistant prosecutor with more confidence than experience, stood eager to impress the wrong crowd. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Callow announced, shooting a smug glance at Douglas. Of course they were ready. They always were when the defendant was a black man. Douglas sensed his client shrinking beside him. Tyrone Wilkes sat with clasped hands and slumped shoulders, the stance of someone battered by life, accustomed to the system crushing his hopes. Douglas leaned forward slightly, his voice clear and steady. "We're ready too, Your Honor." Langford let out a sharp exhale through her nose, her impatience palpable. "Let's get this over with." The trial commenced, but it wasn't a trial. It was a performance, with Langford as the star. Every objection Douglas raised was dismissed before he could fully articulate it. Whenever Callow fumbled an argument, Langford stepped in, guiding him like a teacher coaxing a favored student. The gallery noticed. The jury noticed, yet no one dared speak, except Douglas. He watched Langford closely, the subtle smirk when she spoke, the thinly veiled contempt in her gaze. This wasn't mere bias, it was something colder, more deliberate. Douglas had faced hostile courts before, but this was unique. Langford didn't bother masking her disdain. Each time he spoke, she cut him off. Each time he presented a compelling point, she brushed it aside as if he were a pesky insect. The jury's unease was evident. Even those who might have entered with their own biases couldn't ignore the spectacle. But Langford was unfazed. Her words to Douglas dripped with sarcasm and menace. "Mr. Hayes, you're testing my patience. Mr. Hayes, one more baseless objection, and I'll hold you in contempt." "Mr. Hayes, this isn't a lecture hall. If you want a stage, find one elsewhere." Douglas kept his expression neutral, though inside his anger simmered, not at the insults, which he could handle, but at Langford's personal attacks. That was her mistake. Still, he needed her to keep talking, to expose herself further. The more she revealed, the better his plan would unfold. "Your Honor," Douglas Hayes's voice was steady and deliberate. "The prosecution has introduced evidence not disclosed during discovery. This is a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland." He paused, letting his words echo through the courtroom before concluding, "I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Meredith Langford leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses with a theatrical air of indifference. "Denied," she said flatly. Douglas blinked. not out of shock but as part of a calculated response. He allowed a heavy silence to settle, long enough for the room to feel the gravity of her dismissal. Then, with greater resolve, he pressed, "Your Honor, you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" Langford's lips tightened briefly. "I said denied, Mr. Hayes." Douglas sensed the stir in the courtroom. Reporters scribbling furiously, spectators whispering among themselves. Even the jury shifted uncomfortably. Langford noticed it too. For the first time, her steely gaze locked onto his, cold and unyielding. "You're treading dangerously close to contempt, Mr. Hayes." Douglas tilted his head slightly. "Why, Your Honor? For asking this court to uphold the law?" Her gavel slammed against the bench, the sound reverberating through the vaulted ceiling. "Enough!" she snapped. "One more word and I'll have you removed." The courtroom fell into a profound hush. Douglas could hear his own steady breathing, his pulse calm. This was precisely what he'd anticipated. Beside him, Tyrone Wilkes clenched his fists under the table, his voice a barely audible whisper. "Man, don't let her do you like that." Douglas didn't flinch, his eyes fixed forward. His response was low, controlled. "I'm not done, Your Honor." He sat down, his expression unreadable. Langford smirked, believing she'd asserted her dominance, unaware that she'd just played into his hands. Douglas knew when to push and when to pull back, allowing someone to unravel themselves. Langford was doing exactly that. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, reporters filled their notepads with frantic strokes, and a palpable shift coursed through the room, a growing discomfort, the exposure of a judge too comfortable in her unchecked authority. Yet Langford didn't relent. Instead, she straightened in her chair, resuming her rigid posture, her voice sharp. "Mr. Callow, proceed with your questioning." Philip Callow, the young assistant district attorney, cleared his throat. He was inexperienced but perceptive enough to sense the undercurrent in the room. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, turning to the witness stand, where an elderly store clerk sat, his eyes darting nervously. "Mr. Thomas," Callow began, "can you confirm you saw Tyrone Wilkes at the robbery scene?" The man hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Douglas leaned forward slightly, recognizing the pause. A telltale sign of doubt, the kind that came when someone wasn't as certain as they'd been coached to be. Langford's patience waned. "Answer the question," she demanded, her tone hard. The clerk flinched. I think so," he stammered. Douglas rose swiftly. "Objection, Your Honor. That's not a definitive statement." Langford didn't blink. "Overruled," she snapped. Douglas exhaled slowly, shaking his head subtly. Not for her, but for the jury. They saw it, and it registered. He let Callow ask a few more questions before standing again. It was his turn. He approached the witness stand with measured steps, his gaze sharp and focused. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "you said you think you saw my client that night. How certain are you?" The clerk licked his lips, visibly anxious. "Well, I thought I saw him, but you're not sure." Before the man could answer, Langford cut in sharply. "Move on, Mr. Hayes." Douglas turned slowly, meeting her eyes. Her intervention was too blatant, too revealing. "Your Honor, I'd like the witness to answer." "I said move on, Mr. Hayes," she repeated, her voice taut. Douglas didn't waver. "For the record, Your Honor, you're preventing the witness from clarifying his statement." Langford's face hardened. "I'm warning you, Mr. Hayes." A faint smile touched Douglas's lips, one that conveyed no amusement, only resolve. "Understood, Your Honor." He turned to the witness. "No further questions." He returned to his table deliberately, each step measured, amplifying the tension in the room. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was electric. He felt it. The jury felt it. The gallery felt it. Langford sensed she was losing her grip, and Douglas knew this was the moment. He wasn't here just to win a case. He was here to bring her down. His hand slipped into his briefcase, fingers brushing a stack of documents that held the power to change everything. Then the courtroom doors swung open, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. Every head turned. 2 federal agents entered, dressed in dark suits, their steps purposeful and unwavering. The silence that followed was so absolute it seemed to drain the air from the room. Douglas remained composed, adjusting his tie and folding his hands on the defense table. Langford's eyes flickered, first confusion, then irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" One of the federal agents, a tall figure with a face carved from stone, raised his badge. "Judge Meredith Langford, we need to speak with you immediately." Langford's jaw tightened, her composure fraying. "I'm in the middle of a trial," she retorted, her voice clipped. The agent didn't flinch. "This is urgent." Douglas Hayes caught a fleeting glint in her eyes, not anger, but fear. Then, as if aware she'd betrayed her vulnerability, Langford swiftly masked it, squaring her shoulders. "This is highly improper," she declared. "Whatever it is, it can wait until I've finished these proceedings." The agent stood firm, unmoved. The second one addressed the entire courtroom. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." A low murmur rippled through the room, growing louder as curiosity spread. Even the jury, tasked with impartiality, couldn't hide their intrigue. Philip Callow, the young prosecutor, cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should take a recess, Your Honor?" Langford's fingers pressed hard against the bench, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "No," she snapped. "The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow—" "Judge Langford," the lead agent interrupted, his tone unwavering. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in 24 years, Meredith Langford lost command of her own domain. Douglas Hayes remained still, letting the moment breathe, allowing the weight of the scene to settle into every corner of the room. Then, with deliberate calm, he rose, his gaze sweeping the jury, the gallery, the reporters scribbling furiously, and finally landing on her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but laced with purpose, "I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial, but it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns." Langford's face drained of color, her authority crumbling. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded document from his jacket. His voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "Meredith Langford, you are under arrest on suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violations of federal civil rights laws." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and murmurs of shock, satisfaction, and disbelief. The jury sat frozen, their eyes darting between Douglas and the woman on the bench. Langford's gaze flicked to the agents, the paper, then to Douglas. For the first time, she truly saw him, not as just another lawyer, but as the man who had bided his time for years, waiting for this moment. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice no longer sharp but unsteady, faltering. Douglas picked up his briefcase and stepped closer, meeting her eyes with unshakable resolve. "I warned you," he said softly, his tone calm but firm. "I uphold the law, even when it fails people like me." The lead agent approached the bench. "Judge, we need you to stand." For a long, agonizing second, Langford didn't move. The only sound was the collective held breath of the courtroom. Then slowly, she rose. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed, a final, piercing note in a courtroom where she had ruled with an iron fist for over 2 decades. Now she stood in the same spot where she had condemned countless others. Wrists bound, eyes wild, her power slipping through her fingers. The room buzzed with an electric charge, a rare, unforgettable moment no one had anticipated. The jury, the gallery, the reporters, even Philip Callow, who had scrambled to please her, were struck silent, reeling from the spectacle. Douglas let the quiet linger. He had spent years preparing for this, gathering every shred of evidence, tracking every bribe, every manipulated ruling. He had been patient, playing the long game, knowing that one day her corruption would grow too blatant to ignore. That day had arrived. The federal agent unfolded the document and read the charges aloud. "Meredith Langford, you are arrested for multiple violations of civil rights laws, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Langford found her voice, trembling with defiance. "This is outrageous," she hissed, her eyes blazing. The agent remained unfazed. "Take it up with your lawyer." The gallery hummed with whispers, reporters racing to capture every detail. The tremor in her hands, the way her once commanding presence now seemed diminished. She turned to Douglas, her lips quivering with fury and disbelief. "You did this!" Douglas raised his chin, unflinching. "This is justice." For the first time in her career, the balance of power had shifted. Langford tried to regain her composure, but it was futile. The authority she had wielded for so long had vanished. The irony was stark. For years, Judge Meredith Langford had preached accountability and reverence for the law, yet now she faced the very system she had twisted to her will. The federal agents escorted her toward the courtroom doors, but not before one final sting. A court clerk, who had served under her for decades, who had once bowed to her authority, held the door open without hesitation, treating her like any other defendant. Langford paused as if struggling to grasp the reality before her, then stepped forward. The doors closed behind her with a dull thud, and she was gone. A heavy silence blanketed the room, the magnitude of what had just transpired pressing down on everyone present. Douglas Hayes exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the defense table. Beside him, Tyrone Wilkes turned, his face a mix of disbelief and awe. "Man," Tyrone murmured, shaking his head. "I thought people like her never paid for what they did." Douglas's gaze lingered on the empty judge's bench. "They do," he replied, his voice steady. "Eventually." But a greater lesson still hung in the air, waiting to be learned. The courtroom, once a cold fortress of rigidity, buzzed with life. Whispers erupted in the gallery, some laced with shock, others with quiet satisfaction. Jurors exchanged glances, as if seeking confirmation that they had witnessed the same upheaval. Douglas stood motionless, his mind anchored in the moment. He had fought in courtrooms before, but this was different. He had played a patient, calculated game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Langford's corruption had been too vast, too brazen to remain hidden forever. After years of collecting evidence, tracking her every misstep, justice had finally arrived. Yet Tyrone remained in handcuffs. Langford was gone, but the trial she had orchestrated against him persisted. Douglas turned, his eyes meeting those of Philip Callow, the young prosecutor who had once radiated confidence under Langford's protection. Now Callow sat pale, clutching his notes like a lifeline in a storm, his earlier bravado shattered. Douglas cleared his throat and addressed the new judge, an older black man with gray hair and a reputation for fairness. "Your Honor," he said, his tone resolute, "given recent events, I request the immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The judge laced his fingers together, leaning forward slightly. "On what grounds, Mr. Hayes?" Douglas faced the jury, his voice measured but commanding. This entire trial was tainted from the start. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The arrest of Judge Langford proves what we've always known. She was never impartial, her rulings were never just. Evidence was suppressed, and my client was denied a fair trial." The room fell silent, every ear straining to catch his next words. Douglas turned back to the judge. "Now that the architect of this injustice is in custody, the only course left is to right the wrong she inflicted." The judge studied him for a long moment, his experience weighing every facet of the situation. Then, with a slow nod, he declared, "I concur." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, reverberating through the courtroom. A bailiff approached Tyrone and unlocked his handcuffs. For a fleeting moment, no one moved. Then Tyrone released a long, shuddering breath, one he had held for years. For the first time in ages, his hands were his own again. The moment brimmed with raw emotion so potent that even Callow lacked the will to object. He sat motionless, staring at the table, a man who had lost more than just a case. Tyrone rubbed his wrists, the sensation of freedom returning, and looked at Douglas. "I don't even know what to say," he said softly. Douglas placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to say anything," he replied, pausing before adding, "because today, justice worked. Not because the system was built that way, but because someone fought for it." Tyrone glanced around the courtroom that had nearly consumed him, then walked away without another word. Douglas followed, the weight of their victory pressing against his chest. This wasn't just about Tyrone. It was about every man Langford had wrongfully condemned, every bribe she'd taken, every piece of evidence she'd buried. And it was only the beginning. Douglas had triumphed today, but tomorrow's work loomed. There were other Langfords out there, and he wasn't finished. The story of Douglas Hayes and Judge Meredith Langford reveals a powerful truth. Unchecked power can corrupt, but courage and persistence can dismantle even the most entrenched injustice. It teaches us that standing up to systemic bias, no matter how daunting, is essential for change. In our lives, this means challenging unfair treatment, whether in workplaces, communities, or institutions, and advocating for fairness even when the odds seem stacked against us. Like Douglas, we must be patient, strategic, and unwavering in our pursuit of what's right. This victory reminds us that justice is possible when we fight for it. Thank you for joining this journey of triumph over corruption. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more stories of resilience. Comment below, have you ever confronted injustice in your life? What lessons did you learn? We'd love to hear your experiences.